The transatlantic slave trade wasn't just a European operation. It relied on a vast and complex network of African kingdoms, rivalries, and shifting alliances. Over the course of 4 centuries, more than 12 million Africans were forcibly transported to the Americas. Roughly 85% of those taken from this region, modern-day Ghana to Nigeria, were exported during a single 100-year span between 1700 and 1807, totaling an estimated 4.5 million people during the height of both African warfare and European demand. While Angola and Senegambia were key departure points, the stretch of West Africa between modern-day Ghana and Nigeria became the single most significant source of enslaved people. Some rulers initially resisted, others capitalized, building empires on the backs of war captives. European traders, for their part, rarely used force in this region. Instead, they used gold, weapons, and strategy to entrench themselves in African power struggles and secure a steady stream of human cargo. This episode uncovers how the slave trade transformed West Africa, turning rival kingdoms into cogs in a global system of forced labor, enriching some while destabilizing the entire region. The Kingdom of Benin, located in present-day southern Nigeria, was one of the longest-lasting African kingdoms, with a royal lineage of Obas spanning more than 1,000 years. It's often remembered for its towering walls, advanced governance, and artistic brilliance. By the 1400s, the Kingdom of Benin had become a highly centralized state ruled by the Oba, a divine king who controlled religious, political, and military authority. Under Oba Eware the Great and his successors, Benin expanded its territory, constructed massive earthworks and moats, and built a sophisticated administration. When the Portuguese arrived in the late 1400s, Benin welcomed them cautiously. They traded pepper, ivory, coral beads, and occasionally war captives, but the kingdom refused to fully engage in the emerging transatlantic slave trade. While it allowed some trade in captives, it never fully embraced the large-scale raiding and mass exports seen in neighboring kingdoms. In fact, before the 1700s, Benin's rulers periodically restricted or even banned the slave trade altogether, preferring to focus on art, administration, and diplomacy. The late 1600s and early 1700s brought dynastic conflict, including a power struggle between Oba Akingboy and rival factions. These internal divisions weakened the monarchy's control. European traders, frustrated by Benin's refusal to expand slave exports, began arming rival states such as the Itsekiri and Ijaw. These groups, eager for power and protection, expanded their influence and began launching slave raids of their own. As these rivals gained power and European favor, Benin saw its dominance over the region weaken. As the military balance shifted, Benin's rulers were forced to choose, isolate and fall behind, or adapt. Oba Akinsuwa I, reigned 1713 to 1735, made the decisive turn. He lifted restrictions on the slave trade and negotiated directly with European traders. In exchange for firearms, cloth, and metal goods, Benin began capturing and exporting enslaved people, mainly prisoners of war from internal conflicts and raids on the eastern and northern frontiers. From the 1700s to early 1800s, Benin became a regional hub for human trafficking. The royal palace regulated slave markets, taxed transactions, and deployed troops to capture new supplies of people. Those who resisted royal authority or challenged local chiefs were branded as criminals or rebels and enslaved. Though it briefly controlled Lagos and exported captives through coastal ports, the kingdom's contribution to the transatlantic trade remained limited, estimated at 100,000 to 150,000 people over several centuries. It never embraced the system on the scale of its neighbors. At times, it even restricted slave exports altogether, marking a sharp contrast with what was to come. To the west and north, new powers were rising, kingdoms that would not only embrace the transatlantic slave trade, but build entire empires upon it. By the early 1800s, the tide began to turn. British abolition efforts intensified, and as rival powers like Dahomey and Oyo militarized further, Benin's influence waned. Internal instability returned, and the Obas struggled to maintain control. The final blow came in 1897, When the British launched a full-scale invasion, Benin City was burned, its royal art looted, and the kingdom absorbed into colonial Nigeria. The Kingdom of Benin was one of Africa's great civilizations. Brilliant in art, complex in politics, and strong in tradition. But it was also a kingdom that enslaved its neighbors, adapted to European demand, and grew wealthy from a trade in human beings. To understand West African history, we must tell both stories, the pride and the pain, the splendor of the bronze, and the suffering behind the chains. The Ashanti Empire was one of the most powerful states in West Africa, but behind the gold, pageantry, and royal pride was a brutal system of exploitation. The Ashanti didn't just trade with Europeans, they waged war to supply them with captives. The empire rose to power in the early 1700s, after defeating the Denkira at the Battle of Fayez in 1701. Before their fall, the Denkira had dominated the region since the early 1600s, controlling trade routes and selling captives to European merchants in exchange for firearms. But to truly understand how this system began, we need to go back even further, to the late 1400s, when the Portuguese first arrived on the West African coast and began forming alliances with coastal Akan states. These early relationships laid the foundation for a trade in gold and eventually people that would transform the region for centuries. In 1482, they built Elmina Castle, the first permanent European fort in West Africa, with the cooperation of Fante leaders who controlled the coastal trade routes at the time. The Fante and other coastal peoples were not as centralized or militarily organized as interior empires like Benin and Songhai, which had long-standing political systems and professional armies. This made them more accessible and more easily influenced by European powers. In the beginning, these captives came from far beyond the forest belt, taken in wars, raids, or through tribute systems across the Sahel and Savannah. Muslim and Mande-speaking traders played a central role, moving through ancient empires like Mali and Songhai. They brought enslaved people down from the upper Niger Basin, northern Ghana, Burkina Faso, and eastern Guinea. Some were marched hundreds of miles toward the coast, where they were sold to local rulers or directly to European forts like Elmina. At this time, most coastal kingdoms were not yet slave raiders themselves. They acted as middlemen, profiting from the exchange of gold, ivory, and human beings. But this changed rapidly as the Portuguese and Dutch began trading firearms, creating an arms race that escalated internal conflicts and shifted the balance of power. To keep up, many states began building larger armies and militarizing, often capturing and selling rivals to obtain more weapons and strengthen their forces. This initial coastal partnership set the tone for how Europeans would later exploit disunity and decentralization to entrench themselves across West Africa. The Denkira Empire was the earliest major inland power. One of its most powerful rulers, Nana Boa Amponsam I, built the empire's dominance. He established control over the southern goldfields and centralized Denkira's authority, turning it into the main inland supplier to Portuguese and Dutch traders at Elmina. Under his reign, Denkira gained access to European firearms, which he used to crush rival states and extract tribute. As the slave trade expanded, Denkira began enslaving tributary populations by selling captives to European merchants in exchange for more firearms. His reign set the foundation for Denkira's dominance and the brutality that came with it. Through their access to gold, Denkira became the primary supplier to the Portuguese and, later, the Dutch, who took Elmina in 1637. The Dutch dealt directly with Denkira elites in exchange for gold and firearms, which Denkira used to subjugate neighboring Akan states, including the early Ashanti clans. Meanwhile, Akwamu, a neighboring Akan state, rose in the late 1600s by controlling riverine and overland routes that connected the inland to the slave coast. King Ansa Sasraku I was determined to expand the kingdom's reach by arming his military with European firearms. He struck trade deals with the Dutch and later the British, securing guns and gunpowder in exchange for enslaved captives. Akwamu launched aggressive campaigns to capture people, selling them to the Dutch and later the British. They dealt directly with European merchants at coastal posts like Accra and gained military strength through gun trading. The Fante, Another rival Akan state lived along the coast and played an early intermediary role. They were not as centralized, but became critical facilitators between Europeans and inland states. Over time, their alliance with the British allowed them to rise in power, block inland access, and become rivals to both Denkira and Ashanti. These kingdoms fought each other over control of trade routes, access to European goods, and the power to extract tribute or captives from weaker neighbors. Wars were not just political, they were economic, driven by the opportunity to sell enemies into slavery. Yes, they were selling each other to Europeans. Akwamu sold captives from rival states. Denkira enslaved tributaries. Fante raided and sold enemies inland. European traders exploited these rivalries, offering better prices, guns, or deals to whoever had captives to sell. The Ashanti would arise out of the necessity to protect themselves from powerful rivals and eventually embrace the very systems they once resisted. The Ashanti Empire didn't rise out of peace. It rose from rebellion and war. In the late 1600s, a leader named Osei Tutu emerged to challenge the dominance of the powerful Denkira Empire, which had long forced smaller Akan states into tribute and subjugation. Osei Tutu unified the fractured Ashanti clans and used as sacred symbol the golden stool to bind them under a new national identity. But unity came with conquest. Osei Tutu defeated Denkira at the Battle of Faiese in 1701, and from that moment, the Ashanti were no longer subjects. They were empire builders. The Ashanti state was organized, efficient, and ruthless. Power flowed from the center. Loyalty was rewarded. Rebellion was punished. Entire towns were razed for refusing tribute. Rival leaders were executed and their people enslaved. The empire's strength came not just from gold, but from fear. As European demand for enslaved labor grew in the 1700s, the Ashanti responded with brutal efficiency. They launched war after war, not for land, but for captives. Victories against Akem, Gonja, and Techiman produced thousands of prisoners who were paraded in chains, sold to European traders, or forced into Ashanti servitude. Some worked in agriculture or infrastructure. Others were marched to the coast to die in dungeons before crossing the Atlantic. Ashanti elites profited immensely. Slavery wasn't just tolerated, it was central to state power. The empire taxed the slave trade, regulated it, and built a bureaucracy around it. European goods, especially guns, flooded in, making future conquests even easier. The Ashanti enslaved rebels, neighboring tribes, and sometimes their own. They used terror, intimidation, and public executions to maintain control. When Britain expanded its colonial ambitions in West Africa, it eventually ran into the Ashanti machine. What followed were 5 Anglo-Ashanti wars, fought between 1824 and 1900. At first, the Ashanti resisted with the same force they used on their neighbors. But Britain brought more than muskets. It brought empire. After early victories like the Battle of Insamanko, the tide turned. In 1874, British forces captured and burned Kumasi, and in 1900, after the War of the Golden Stool, the Ashanti were annexed into the Gold Coast colony. The Ashanti Empire was not an ancient kingdom. It was a creation of its time. It rose during the height of the transatlantic slave trade, built on war, expansion, and the relentless demand for captives. Its power was forged in the fires of Africa's internal wars, and its economy thrived by feeding the slave markets along the coast. In this way, Ashanti was fundamentally different from Benin. The Kingdom of Benin had existed for centuries before the Europeans arrived and established a civilization with deep cultural roots and early resistance to the slave trade. Ashanti, by contrast, emerged as a militarized state, shaped by that trade. But Ashanti was not the only kingdom to rise from war and profit. To the east, the Oyo Empire and the Kingdom of Dahomey followed similar paths, turning slave raiding into national policy and violence into power. In the next episode, we journey deeper into the slave coast, where the empires of Oyo and Dahomey helped transform West Africa into one of the most militarized and devastated regions in history. Thank you for watching. If you found this video insightful, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue uncovering the hidden truths of history. Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and stay tuned for more deep dives into the past. See you in the next video.